Welcome. My name is Frank Perri, and I'll be introducing you to red collar crime, a term that I coined and a concept that I developed representing white collar offenders who resort to violence in order to prevent the detection and/or disclosure of their fraud schemes. Typically, when we think of white collar crime, we have certain visuals in our mind. For example, the high level executive, such as the chief financial officer or the chief executive officer, exploiting an organization's internal controls for financial gain. Or alternatively, we may think of a predatory fraud offender. Those are individuals who target people or groups of people for financial gain. An individual that comes to mind, and perhaps you will have heard of him, is Bernard Madoff. This was the person that orchestrated a multi-billion-dollar Ponzi scheme several years ago. Now, on balance, we typically don't equate white-collar crime with violence. And yet, a subgroup of white-collar offenders does exist where they perceive violence as a solution to a perceived problem. Well, why is it that we don't necessarily make associations between white-collar crime and violence? I think in part it has to do with the fact that white-collar crime is classified as a nonviolent offense, in that we are talking about intentional misrepresentations. We are talking about manipulations of other people, but not with force. But the characterization of white-collar crime also lends itself to misinterpretation. And we're going to be needing more research in order to understand the white-collar offender group. There are certain consequences that come with not understanding the profile of white-collar offenders. What are they? In part, it has to do that we end up relying on speculation. We rely on our own biases to construct in our mind what we think an offender group actually represents that may be totally inaccurate. What do I mean by that? Well, for example, if we assume that the offense is nonviolent, we make certain assumptions that the offender is nonviolent, assumptions that are repeated with enough regularity that they are accepted as fact, especially at times within academic communities or the judiciary. Those are, for example, judges who have to preside over fraud cases. Let me give you an example. I recall reading a judge stating that white-collar offenders are not threatening other people. They are not violent people. Well, this individual has an opinion about white-collar offenders, but it is not supported by the evidence. Why is this problematic? There may be times when we don't understand an offender group that we may end up ignoring warning signs, red flags that, for example, red-collar offenders may display, but that we ignore, which means we may end up threatening our own existence. Moreover, it can actually impact on how we conduct our investigations. Do we, in fact, have a more robust interview process with a potential red-collar crime offender? Or are we relying on assumptions that, well, this suspect is more likely than not going to be the individual that actually committed the homicide? Now, these are but a few of the questions that we're going to be looking at as we progress in our lectures. My goal is to provide you with a framework, a template to understand red-collar crime, and we'll be looking at case studies to illustrate what these offenders are capable of. Moreover, we're going to be looking at psychological factors. For example, are there certain personality traits certain white-collar offenders have that can facilitate the decision to rely on violence? Moreover, we're going to be looking at the methodologies of violence, how they in fact go about planning to eliminate an individual. We'll be looking at distinctions between male and female red-collar offenders, and in fact, they do exist, and we'll explore what those distinctions are. We'll be looking at the relationship between red-collar crime and the family, intimate relationships, husband and wife, parent and child, clients and friends of ours that may resort to red-collar crime. Moreover, we'll be discussing the relationship between red-collar crime and workplace violence. I do believe that this should be of particular interest to individuals who I would characterize as anti-fraud professionals, such as forensic accountants, fraud examiners, compliance specialists, attorneys, individuals that may come into contact with financial irregularities. Now, we'll also be having a question and answer segment. I do believe this will be of particular interest because we're going to be looking much deeper into the red collar crime process. And we'll also be discussing some sensitive areas, particularly as they relate to the family. I really want to thank you for taking the time to listen, and I know that you're going to find these lectures truly interesting and thought-provoking.